Like levels, grids provide organization and structure to your projects. Grids serve to locate the structural columns in your project and provide key points of reference for views and sheets alike. Unlike levels, not all buildings need grids. For example, most residential projects would not have a need for grids. However, most commercial buildings do have a need for column grids. Therefore, the kind of project you're creating will often dictate the need for grids. Now, you don't have to create the grids right away, but it's a pretty good idea to create them early in the project just to help establish that form and structure. And there's a lot of similarities between creating grids and creating levels. So I'm going to go to the Architecture tab, and I'm working currently in a Level 1 floor plan. And over here on the Datum panel, you'll see the Grid button. I'll click that, and like levels before, there are some different shapes that we can use. Unlike levels, we can actually draw grids as curves in addition to straight lines. Now, for this first example, I'm going to just start with a straight line, and I'm actually going to start out here on the outside of the building off to the left. So I'm just going to click a point down here below the building. And notice that you can draw this at any angle you like, but I'm going to pull it straight up, make sure that the angle says 90 degrees vertical, and then I'm going to click again to create that grid. Now, rolling my wheel, I'll zoom in a little bit, and I want to point out that there is no bubble at the first point that I clicked. The bubble appears at the second point. So if you know that going in, then you can plan your clicks accordingly so that you get the bubbles on the side of the plan that you want them in. Now, if you don't think of that ahead of time, it's not a big deal because as we talked about when we were discussing levels, there's this little check mark right here where you can uncheck to remove a bubble or check it to add a bubble. So you can always reverse the annotation at either end if you wanted to. Now, let me cancel out of the command for a moment, zoom in, and notice that this grid came in as grid number 1. Now, what I want to do is show you the way that Revit numbers grids. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this grid. I'm going to zoom back out, and I'm going to add a new grid here. So back on the Datum panel, I'm going to click Grid. And I want to make sure that I'm not lining up directly with this wall. I want to come in just to the inside of this wall a little bit, below the building, click my first point, and then pull it straight up, make sure it's going parallel, and then click again. And notice that if you zoom in here, that grid came in as number 2, even though I deleted grid number 1. Revit remembers the previous number that you left off with, and it will just continue from that point on. So if you don't notice this and you start adding a bunch of grids, you might be in a situation where you have to go back later and renumber all those grids. Now, it's possible to renumber a grid anytime you like, but you can't have 2 grids that have the same number. So keep that in mind that it might actually be a decent amount of work to renumber them later. So a much better solution is to pause before you do anything else, come over here and click right on the value, number 2 in this case. That will make it editable text and change it to what you want it to be. Now, if I wanted numbered grids in this direction, I might choose 1. If I want lettered grids, I might type letter A. So I'm going to put in capital A here, press enter, and now that becomes grid bubble A. I'll zoom back out, come down here below the building, make sure it's lining up with the first grid, but inside the exterior wall, pull it straight up until it snaps again, and that will create the second grid. Let me do it again over here. And notice that I now get A, B, and C. I'm going to make a couple more. Here's D, and here's E. Now, don't worry too much about the exact locations of these grids yet. We're going to fine-tune all those positions in the next movie. What I want to do right now is just focus on the mechanics of building the grids. Now, that gives me the lettered grids, and then I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to create my horizontal grid running this way, and notice that it continues where we left off in the other direction. So Revit won't assume that just because you change direction, you want to change your numbering. So once again, it's up to you to notice that and come in here and change back to numbers if in fact that's what you want in this case. So I'm going to set that one back to number 1, add in grid number 2, again being careful to keep it parallel, zoom out a touch, I'll add grid 3, and then finally grid 4. Now, I've deliberately snapped them all at this end. I'm going to click the Modify tool to cancel out of the command. I'm going to select any one of these grids, and because they're all snapped together at this end, I can move any one of them, and they'll all move together. We saw the same thing when we did levels in the previous movie. On this side, only these 2 are snapped together. So I could certainly manipulate those 2, but it wouldn't affect grids 3 or 4. Now, if you want them to work together, you just simply need to stretch it until it snaps and attaches itself to the other one, and then they'll lock together, and then those 2 will move together. If for some reason you didn't want that behavior, simply unclick the lock here, and then you can drag it freely. So it's entirely up to you which behavior you want. But whenever you snap them together, they will always relock themselves. Now, if I go back to the grid tool on the architecture tab, I mentioned that we could do curved grids. So that's an option. So in some complex buildings, you might need to do that. And you can also do multi-segment grids. Now, multi-segment grids puts us in a special mode called sketch mode. Now, we're going to discuss sketch mode in great detail in a future movie, but basically the way this works is you just sort of sketch out different segments to create a custom-shaped grid. And then to cancel the command to finish the mode, you click this big green checkbox right here, and that finishes the mode. And notice that this grid 6 here now has this irregular shape to it. So if you have a complex building that requires either curved or multi-segment grids, you can do both of those things and just create them however you want. In this case, I'm actually going to click on grid 5, hold the Control key, click on grid 6, and I'm going to delete those two because they're not necessary for this building. Now, the last thing I want to point out is that all datum elements, and in this case, we've seen levels in the previous movie and grids in this movie, they behave in the same fashion in that they will only display in orthographic views and they will only display when they're perpendicular to the viewing plane. So right now we're seeing the grids because we're drawing them perpendicular to this floor plan view. But notice that if you open up one of the elevations, I'm going to open the south elevation, that the lettered grids are displaying here as well. So what this tells us is that these things are actually more like a plane. So if you think of a really thin sheet of paper cutting through your building at the location of grid C, we're seeing the top edge of that sheet of paper in floor plan, and we're seeing the front edge of that sheet of paper here in the elevation. And the same would be true if you went to an east or west elevation. Now you'd be seeing the numbered grids, and you'd be seeing the edges of those planes. And notice that the levels are showing in any elevation, but when we go back to a floor plan, we don't see the levels because we're now looking right down on those levels, which is the same thing we saw a moment ago when we were here in the east elevation. We didn't see the lettered grids because we were looking right at their plane. You only see them when they're perpendicular to the viewing angle. So that's an important consideration to keep in mind. So laying out your grids is a useful early step to do early on in the project to establish the locations of where all your columns will be. You can fine-tune the positions of them anytime and make adjustments anytime. And in the next movie, we're going to look at fine-tuning the positions of those grids very precisely relative to the building geometry. But once you've established your datum elements, that's going to give form and structure to the building ongoing as you continue working on the project model.